Today we'll be talking about the ideas of Marxism, fascism, and communism, how they affect societies, and how they have slowly but surely seeped into the free world. Are they dangerous? Is it something that we should be idolizing, or something that we really want to enter the door in our culture? Or should we be fighting it off with everything that we have? If you live in the United States of America, we've all had the opportunity to go to school, to be educated, to buy and sell freely, exchange ideas. But is that possible in a society like a Marxist society, like a communistic society? I hope you were able to watch my previous episodes with Dr. Bernard Mauser on socialism and social justice. We'll be getting into even deeper here with the concepts that flow from socialism. So if you haven't watched them already, please go back and take a look at those episodes. Today, my special guest is Dr. Corey Miller. He is currently the president and CEO of Ratio Christi, is a Christian apologetic campus ministry. There are Ratio Christi organizations on hundreds of campuses all over the world. So it's a real pleasure and a treat to have Dr. Miller with us today. He grew up in Utah as a seventh-generation Mormon, and he came to Christ in 1988. Since then, he has served on pastoral staff at 4 churches and has taught nearly 100 college courses in philosophy, theology, rhetoric, and comparative religions at various universities. From 2009 to 2015, he served on staff with Crew's Faculty Commons Ministry at Purdue. He taught philosophy and comparative religions at Indiana University for 12 years. He's the author of several books and articles. Dr. Miller holds master's degrees in philosophy, biblical studies, and in philosophy of religion and ethics. His PhD is in philosophical theology from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. He makes me feel like a lackey. He's passionate about defending the Christian faith, just like many of us. And that's why we're here, to learn more about how to engage in those conversations that count in our culture, even when it's changing at the pace with which it's changing. I'm Catherine Camp. Welcome to Faith and Culture. Let's get started. Well, hi, Corey. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Catherine. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being here, because there's so much to learn about Marxism and communism and socialism, what we're all going through right now in the economy, and how it's going to affect us personally, how it's going to affect our Christian faith, or is it going to be affected at all? But in the end, what we really want to know is, what is the culture doing around us, so that as Christians, we can best reach out to people who really begin to feel the pressure of their mortality and being lost and maybe not understanding things. So let's go ahead and start. I think you mentioned we're going to talk about Marxisms today. Tell us what that is. I've never heard that term, Marxisms.
Yeah, well, I'll hope to disclose that over a couple of episodes, but in Marxism, you have a variety of evolution of that idea, Marxism being the political ideology of Karl Marx and his co-worker Frederick Engels. But then you have, offshoots of it from Mao Zedong, the revolutionary in China, who coined the expression, "A revolution is not a dinner party." Think about that. And then you have Vladimir Lenin, State and Revolution, or his views on revolution. He was the one who launched the communist revolution, the Marxist revolution, in the early 1900s in Russia to become the Soviet Union. And then you have offshoots of Marxism that would be like anarchism. You would have cultural Marxism, which is where we want to end up thinking about where we're at today, because we are in this country living in no less than a cultural revolution. And in all the revolutions that I have studied, the Marxist revolutions, if you can begin with the French Revolution, which it wasn't really a Marxist revolution, it was the one that Marx and Lenin looked at and said, that's the ideal revolution. It was bloody, and it was effective in taking over an organ, a country, a people,
Wow.
for their good, of course, right?
For who's good? For the people or for the leaders?
Right. I mean, think about the People's Republic of China. It's for the people. Yeah, and you're right. Ultimately, it is for the leaders. A good communist never ends up sleeping in the same squalor and tent as the proletariat workers that he used to launch the revolution in the first place, right? So there are a variety of different Marxisms, and not all of them are revolutionary, because the neo-Marxists, the cultural Marxists, we might look at as the failed revolutionary Marxists, because they were dominated by the fascists, didn't ultimately fail. They simply incubated and migrated to the West, and it's that neo-Marxism that we're now experiencing today. Not the Leninism, Stalinism, or Maoism, but a different
one. Can you define for people who don't know? I know they've heard a lot about fascism because Antifa, meaning anti-fascism, and here in the United States, we're just not really mainstream familiar with that term. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, you mean fascism? The
fascism.
Definition of it? Okay, so, I mean, fascism, it brands itself as a sort of socialism. And so the two fascist regimes that we saw, national socialist regimes that we saw, where Marxist ideologues were dominated, were in Germany and in Italy. So under Hitler and Mussolini, for example. So the Nazi Party is called the National Socialist Party, right? And so fascism is a form of socialism different from communism insofar then as it's a kind of a big government socialist centrally planned economic system and ideology. It is socialist, but it is nationalistic in its geographical borders, and it is centered more internally than communism. I guess you might look at how everything relates to ownership, right? So a communist system is state-owned, state produces everything, state decides how everything is produced, and how it's all distributed in a redistribution. Fascism, well, let's start with free market economy. We call capitalism. Marx called capitalism. We might better yet call it free market systems. But ownership is private. What gets produced is privately decided by the business or individual. How it's produced is private by the business or the individual.
Right.
And how it's distributed. Fascism combines a little bit of those in that it allows private property. The state determines what is produced, but fascism kind of how it's produced. And then the state largely how it's distributed. So the irony is we see certain socialists in our country today, like AOC or Bernie Sanders, they might be headed more toward a kind of fascism than they are a communism, except for the fact that they don't like borders. And so that puts them closer to the globalist socialists, the communists, than to the national socialists, the fascists. And so communism then would be a political theory derived from Marx that advocates class warfare, leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid equally according to their abilities and needs. So it's a social redistribution. Communism is statism from top to bottom. Capitalism or free market is private ownership and production and distribution from top to bottom, and fascism sort of combines them.
Interesting. So I think I veered us off in a little bit of a different direction. Let's get back to Marxisms. Go ahead and educate us.
Yeah, so I think I had a meme or a post that I put up a little while ago on Facebook. I think I sent it to you too, and it was shared almost 200 times, and it says 7 things that every kid needs to hear. I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. I forgive you. I'm listening. Communism has failed every time it was tried, and you've got what it takes.
I loved that one.
Yeah, it's funny and it gets the point across. But most communists, I remember in graduate school at Purdue when I was taking a class on Marxism by a distinguished professor of Marxism, they like to say that, well, you cite all of these places and say that it has failed. It's never really been tried, right? It's not been really tried in Venezuela or North Korea or China or Russia. All of those were mixed up with, bureaucracy and bourgeois interests, and so it never really was tried. On the one hand, you want to say, yeah, right. On the other hand, there is a sense in which it's true, because Marx saw history as moving in a certain direction. Marxism or Marxisms is a view about the good life, ultimately. It is about utopia, the way things ought to be, even though he didn't really have an ethical system. Many people think that Marxism has failed because in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. But at the same year, the Tiananmen Square incident happened in China. And this past week, I had the pleasure of meeting one of the original student protesters in that Tiananmen Square now, who's a pastor. I've also seen the wall. I've met people who experienced what was behind the wall. People who have grown up in these communist-leaning societies. And when Marxists try and say that it's never really been tried, in one sense they're right, and it's because Marx had a view of history that went through kind of 6 economic phases. You have the, primitive communism, move to slavery, a move to feudalism, where you had, the lords and the serfs, the nobility and the crown, and that was, what it was about in Russia, with Lenin looking at the Tsar that had reigned for almost 300 years in that same family. So you have the feudalism of Europe and Russia, and then it evolves into capitalism, this view where there's this surplus labor, where everything is always wrapped up between the ownership of wealth and property and the worker. And the poor are always getting poorer on the back, and the capitalist is getting richer on the back of that poor serf. And so there's this surplus capital, which is where the capitalists come from. Well, he thought that, and he made predictions, and some were failed predictions, and others tried to buttress those, creating different kinds of Marxism and so forth. But capitalism was said to have its own internal self-destruction, so that it would evolve to the next stage, which is socialism. And socialism is where there is revolution on some level that takes place, what Lenin called the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the workers of the world unite and finally throw off the shackles of the bourgeois, the ruling class. And then whether the anarchists or the Leninists are right, that proletariat, that intermediate state of socialism, it too needs to be abolished by revolution, according to the anarchists, or it simply, as Marx and Lenin thought, it would simply just somehow wither away into the final state, which is communist utopia that John Lennon and the Beatles asked us to imagine in his gospel song Imagine, right? And so in one sense, yeah, we haven't gotten to that communist utopia yet. We're never told how to get there. We just know it's going to be very, very costly, and we need to keep trying until we get there. And so you hear, from various of these members, Gramsci in Italy, who was imprisoned by Mussolini, and whose father wrote the works of Gramsci, was Mayor Pete Buttigieg in Indiana, the presidential candidate. But he says socialism is precisely the religion that must replace Christianity. So for those people who think that socialism and Christianity are compatible, you got to think about that. Lenin said on his book Religion, atheism is the natural and inseparable part of communism. That's on page 1. It's the natural and inseparable part of it. How can Christianity then coexist? Stalin said when he took power and wrote this book in 1932, The 5-Year Plan of Atheism, he said that by, I think it was by May of 1937, there should be not a single church left within the borders of the Soviet Russia, and that the idea of God will have been banished from the Soviet Union as a remnant of the Middle Ages. Mao Zedong said that we will substitute materialism for idealism and atheism for theism. Clearly, it was about atheism. Chavez said socialism is the way to save the planet. Capitalism is the road to hell, and we can see how that ended. And then finally, to kind of bring it all together, Marx himself in the Communist Manifesto, and we need to take care, Catherine, to think about this, that when people think, you're talking conspiracy theory, communism's dead, it's over there, only, Kim Jong-il continues to operate in that way. No. Apart from the Bible, the Communist Manifesto is the most sold book in human history. It offers competing narrative of where history is going. And Marx said this at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. There are, besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society, but communism abolishes eternal truths, it abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experiences. So communism, the theory by Karl Marx, a political ideologue, is about the abolition of private property, of morality, of eternal truths, of all religion. And those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
That is so true, and that's why we're doing what we do. You are busy on college campuses, and I'm trying to reach people through these video series. It's so important. I think a lot of students today, I know too many of them that actually believe that the Black Lives Matter movement was actually about, African Americans or dark-skinned people,
right,
when they have done nothing to help them. You don't even have to scratch the surface very hard to find what they stand for in their manifesto, not what the media tells you. I call them the propaganda media now. It's not what they're telling you, but if you actually look at their manifesto, They want to break up the family. I mean, everything that you just kind of said, they need to break everything up. No private property. It's right there. And so, and of course, it's made billions of dollars and made the three women who started it very wealthy, wealthy enough to buy $1 million homes all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
But no neighborhoods that they burned down ever got a penny of that. And neither did struggling African-American families. So it had nothing to do with helping or elevating anybody but themselves. Yeah, and like you say,
Right.
it's like it's the ruling class that continues to be fine, and everyone else is going to suffer.
That's right. And I think that, Marxism is very clever in that it offers people a vision of the good. I think it's taken root in our culture so quickly and successfully because it does what, I'd like to get into in another episode eventually and how it invaded the West. But it capitalizes, if I can use that term, um, on the sentiments of the West about true freedom, about religion, about justice. And Marxism is ultimately it is a religion in terms of it being something of ultimate concern. Buddhism is a religion,
Yeah.
and it is non-theistic. So, being a religion doesn't require the belief in a god if Buddhism is a religion, and Marxism certainly has a competing vision of the good, but it capitalizes on religious sentiment about concepts of justice and injustice. And so you look at the crises, when you first read Marx's Das Kapital, you see what was happening in, the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution. And there was some squalor that came along with that. No one has ever said that, capitalism is a perfect system. But along with that, the trajectory was that it is all and only bad, and that employees are always the slave of their employer. And so capitalizing on those notion of slaves in America has been, I think, very effective.
Yeah. Do you think that with your what you've studied on the Marxism that we're talking about right now, that they're trying to break down different classes and looking at capitalism and a free market, that they have introduced this? Because I know from what I see of, I guess it's the people ages between, I would say 25 to 40, that there is some sort of a class struggle or division. There's a dislike of very wealthy people, and that's why we've been hearing a lot of politicians, I know for my adult life, trying to say, oh, we've got to overtax these really wealthy people. And everyone's, cheering on, yes, of course, do it. And anyhow, I'm just wondering, because I know that some of their tactics are to divide people. They divide and conquer. And I feel like they're doing that here. And the class thing hasn't worked lately because everybody's been doing well. Even our poorest people here are wealthier than 96% of the poor people all over the world. So they've gone to race, these race revolutions now.
Yeah, that's right. And that would be a neo kind of Marxism that I hope to discuss in a future episode. But yes, they start to micro analyze across the board these various classes. And so Marxism proper, in classical Marxism, focuses on the economic theory, right? And you've got the bourgeois and the proletariat. And so you get your pitchforks, you get your torches, and you go out and you find the rich guy, the owner. and not realizing how much it's changed today, where, owners are 401k owners, right? The employees now are owners of the corporation. So much has changed, but people don't get that. But even in Mao, when you read Maoist Marxist writings, you go after the richest 1%, but then once you've got people focused on that, you problematize that and you create an enemy, you find an enemy, then you can enlarge it and go after the 2%, and then the 5%, and then the 10%, and then the 49%. And so there's no stopping. And eventually, when we get to discussing race, there's even a spectra of color too, not just white privilege, but brown privilege, and maybe something for the future. But yeah, the market-based systems. I think there's this is where people don't pay attention to George Santayana. They don't remember their past. They're condemned to repeat it. They don't even know what capitalism is. They just hear that it's a bad thing. And so 70% of millennials and Gen Z regard socialism in positive thinking, and thinking, that it's going to provide greater security, unity, and equality. But they don't, Marx didn't understand economic systems well, and neither do the followers today. We probably, it'd be best to call it, market-based systems, because capitalism is emotive and misleading, and things have radically changed. As I mentioned that, the workers owning companies today have 401ks, making the workers today also the capitalists. And as you pointed out, our poorest people are rich. Capitalism has brought 4 billion people out of poverty. We still have billions left to go, but so much greater than what socialism has done. And it's simply because it's based on what Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, talked about as God's invisible hand. It's something that is natural to the supply and demand way that market economies work, that you have producers, you have consumers, and the producer comes up with a good or a product at a price that is agreeable to the consumer, and they call that the value exchange. And both are pursuing their own self-interests, but self-interest, you have to question, is that a bad thing? And so Smith made this statement. He says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect to get our dinner, but from regard to their own self-interest. The butcher, the brewer, and the baker all have self-interest in competing for certain things, but because of that competition and other virtues that fall out of it, that maybe we'll discuss in a little bit, virtues of capitalism, it makes the world, by and large, a better place. Everyone's pursuing self-interest, but is self-interest necessarily a bad thing?
Right. And you also, I feel like you get a lot more variety to choose from, because everyone is free to create and engage in the economic system.
Right. I think, when we look at maybe certain virtues that we can see in capitalism, there's a good book that I would recommend to your listeners, The Virtues of Capitalism, a moral case for free markets, or if they wanted, from a Christian standpoint, recent book out by a University of Chicago economist, Socialism and Capitalism, What Does the Bible Have to Say? Those are two good ones to consider. But, benefits, not only has capitalism as an economic system provided the greatest production of wealth for the world that it has ever seen, including bringing more poor out of poverty, while the rich get richer, but the poor get less poor as well. It offers freedom and creativity, initiative, cooperation, civility, responsibility. It produces several virtues that socialism does nothing for any of those. It seems to make us poorer economically, but poorer on the scale of flourishing human beings too, because it makes people perpetual recipients rather than participants in wealth creation. This statism is nothing but wealth redistribution. The state does not make wealth; it only takes wealth in socialist systems.
Right. I heard somebody recently, I don't even remember who said it, but they said, if you're looking for equity, that's a race to the bottom. If you're looking for equality, that's getting your way to the top. I thought, okay, think about that. It's true, because equity means they have to take from everybody to give equally. And equality, we work at other things to, I guess, be fair and virtuous to each other.
Yeah, and I think that's one move that's happening right now, again, in contemporary neo-Marxism in the West, is this push for equity. But even equality, very interestingly, is something that somehow has been misunderstood and smuggled in. Lenin says in his book, State and Revolution, democracy means equality, right? So we hear this pushed by neo-Marxists about equality. We also hear that we're a democracy. We're not a democracy. That's a political system that Aristotle, for example, hated. It's a mob rule, which is worse than a tyrant rule. We are a republic, res publica, the public thing, the law. We are a constitutional republic governed by the law, not by a mob. The law rules as king. So we're not a democracy. But democracy means equality. The great significance of the proletariat struggle for equality and of equality as a slogan will be clear if we correctly interpret it as meaning the abolition of classes. So how we get to that equality is kind of along the lines. It's the evolutionary conscious development, we might say, about how to ultimately emancipate us from our slavery, from our proletariat alienation. The worker is alienated from himself when he is subordinated by other people in this class conflict, in this conflict theory. And so we need to abolish all classes. And of course, in classical Marxism, among the Marxisms, the focus was really on the economics. But even Marx had the seeds that it wasn't ultimately, about economics. We get, in the West, one of the things that's criticized, of course, is capitalism. But this has a derivation, you might say, from Christianity. A very recent book, and a very good one, by Benjamin Friedman, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. This wasn't something that a lot of liberal atheists, not illiberal Marxist atheists, but the classical liberals who are fighting against today's cancel culture, like Steven Pinker at Harvard, want to make the case that capitalism derived from the Enlightenment values of humanism. It did not. It has religious core behind it. And this is why the neo-Marxists who criticize nationalism, who criticize Western colonialism with its capitalist push, ultimately go back to the meta-narrative of the Bible, where it comes from, right? I mean, capitalism, I wouldn't say is the biblical model. The Bible doesn't set forth an economic biblical model for all time. It does give principles, but much of the criticism has been misplaced. So let me mention 4 of them, and then people can jump into those books for greater elaboration.
Right.
Capitalism is all about greed, right? Even if it involves self-interest, is it really about greed? Well, the Apostle Paul tells us in Thessalonians to look not only after your own self-interest, but after the interest of others. Self-interest is not the same thing as selfishness. Self-interestedness is part of that invisible hand of God that was talked about in 1776 by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations.
Right.
Greed is in socialism too, right?
Oh yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. It's everywhere. It's a human nature kind of thing. It's built into us.
yeah.
It's a tendency that we can have, but we can also control it.
Yeah, it's a spiritual problem. It's not an economic problem.
Right.
One man's greed is another man's envy. The number two is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer is based on a philosophical outlook of what we might call the zero-sum game, or the zero-sum fallacy of the socialist pie, which assumes that the pie is necessarily fixed. So, Catherine, if you have a larger piece of the pie and I have a smaller piece, it means that, as Obama said to Joe the plumber, you didn't earn that, right? Somehow you stole that. Somehow inequality entails injustice. Number three, capitalism leads to an overconsumption or to materialism. Again, that's a spiritual problem, not an economic one, and changing systems doesn't resolve that. And then finally, number four, what I already mentioned, that capitalism leads to inequality. Look, the rich do get richer in capitalism. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that the poor get poorer. Biblically, it's the possession of wealth is not the problem, but it's obsession. And it provides a greater opportunity for generosity, too. The assumption that inequality is injustice is false. God never says in the Bible that he hates inequality. We're never even told that equality is a virtue. We're told that justice is. He hates injustice and he hates oppression.
Mm-hmm. Right. What I noticed, what I was hearing, after all of those Antifa and BLM riots that were happening last summer around this time, it started to ramp up, that the whole goal was to really, and also that all these shutdowns, the people that were really hurt were the middle class, the small business owners, because they were forced to shut down while the bigger stores were allowed to stay open. And if the people I've heard talking about it, who seem to see a larger agenda at hand here, were pointing out that 82% of our GDP comes from small businesses. So if you can wipe those out, you can start to have an upper class and an impoverished class, which makes people easier to rule at that point. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
What's the specific question?
As far as us going towards or being pushed towards a more socialistic or a totalitarian or communistic kind of economic system, where they're really pushing this equality or equity on the Americans, actually the world. I mean, it's all over the world.
Well, and that's what distinguishes.
Yeah,
that's what distinguishes. Notice all these are in red, right? Behind me in red, blood and the Red Army and Red and the Devil. Another great book recently, The Devil and Karl Marx.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, by Paul Kengor. My son's going to be studying under him next year. But, he opens with a poem of Marx. Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell. That's the road paved to this utopia. Part of the problem in this, globalist socialism, as opposed to Hitler's and Mussolini's nationalist socialism, is that it knows no borders. And that's why we always talked about stopping the spread of communism. By definition, it is anti-nationalist. It is anti-colonialist. And that's where that language comes from today. It is globalist. It is about redistributing the global wealth of the world. And so insofar as we find our politicians doing that and claiming some socialistic infatuation, you have to wonder where they're coming from. But yeah, it's a part of the problem with the system as a system is that it de-incentivizes wealth production. As I've taught for a dozen years at places like Indiana University and Purdue, when I teach an ethics class, I will talk to them about how I just graded their last exam, and I'm really discouraged, but I'm really empathetic. I realize that there is a bunch of inequality there, that some people have had charter schools and private schools and maybe private tutors. Others have had public schools and growing up in squalor conditions. And because of that, it's just not fair that I give them, some of them A's and some B's and C's and D's and F's. And so I said the average grade was a B minus. Therefore, what I'm going to do for all future exams is I'm going to give you all B minuses. How many are up for that? Right? No one on the top half raises their hands. The bottom half, they raise their hands, but it's equal. I don't want to go after the 50%, remember. I want to start with the 1% or maybe 10 or maybe 75%. So I'll say, I'll be more generous than that. You've tried hard. We're going through difficult times. We're going to give you all B pluses. How about that? Now I've got the majority in my class going with this. And then I say, I think that sounds fair in light of the inequalities of opportunity. We need to be able to pursue some equity here in light of some of the inequalities of the past. And then I said, but let me ask a question. What will that do to you who are A students? Will you try harder for the next exam if I do that? None of them raise their hands.
Yeah.
And I say, how about you F students? Will you try harder? They laugh, of course. Why should they? They're going to get a B plus.
Right.
I ask the D students, same thing. I ask the C students, same thing. B students, the same thing. What that tells me is that virtually every student is not going to try harder once we give a equal redistribution in terms of equity. It de-incentivizes excellence and human flourishing. It does not help with the dignity of the human being to make them into what America has become and what a lot of nations in the West have become, not socialist per se, but welfare states, right? The move towards socialism, but they're not fully socialist yet because government doesn't control the means of production. But it doesn't help. It makes the world poorer, not more wealthy. It is socialism that is the road to hell, contrary to Hugo Chavez. Look at his country.
I heard about that, and what you're describing, pretty much what happened in South America, in some of those areas like Chile and Venezuela, where after a while there was no incentive to really do any work, and people would come, and I'm just saying what the commentator, the person narrating the documentary, said, that they would come to work and just do crossword puzzles. They're just getting their check. And so what it did is, because everything was state owned, the whole country began to fall. Economically, they had their GDP, and there was no growth at all. It completely stunted it. In fact, it made it worse. And it went on to talk about India and the problems there when they had really hardcore socialism and, raise their tariffs or no tariff. They weren't allowing for trade. Anyhow, it was very interesting to see. It will destroy an economy because there won't be any incentive to do anything because you're already getting a paycheck. It's like what we're going through right now. We've had these little businesses starting to try and open up here in Virginia, and some of them, these popular little restaurants, we've gone to them and they're closed because they can't find any employees. Mm-hmm. Because everyone was so happy getting their stimulus check, and I was like, this is ridiculous. What are people thinking? I would rather work for my money and not be dependent on the government, because that is not, it's so volatile. You can't depend on that at all.
Right. Why think that somehow the government is more efficient or effective or more compassionate with monetary funds? Again, the Bible does come out against oppression. It does suggest that God has a heart for the poor and the oppressed and the downtrodden.
Yeah.
But nowhere do we find this concept that equality, especially coerced equality, is somehow a virtue. Justice is a virtue, but fairness is never mentioned in the Bible as a virtue. Even with the founding fathers, when we talk about equality, we're talking about equality as it resonates with freedom, that no external force ought to have the ability to coerce me as an independent agent, having equally the freedom to operate as a person endowed by its creator with unalienable rights of life, first of all, liberty or freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. These political and economic freedoms, which were often ascribed to the Enlightenment, derived previously from the Protestant reformers making, religious freedom decisions enshrined in the founding documents, right? And so the Bible gives the marching orders, and it begins with humans being created in God's image with inestimable dignity, to be left alone, but also some not just negative ethics, but positive ethics. But one of them is not coerced redistribution or theft, despite the fact that Raphael Warnock, the now Senator Warnock of Georgia, said that the early Christian church was socialist.
Yeah, they use that Acts, that passage out of Acts where everybody shared everything in common. And that is just completely taking it out of context, because people were still allowed to own land, and they weren't forced to give. It's completely different. It was a virtuous thing. You gave what you wanted to, not forced.
Right. And that's where, the Jew, Karl Marx, was not a good Jew. He rejected his Judaism. He rejected God's existence. And he nonetheless was influenced by it. When you read even in Lenin of the statement, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, there is a cursory reading of biblical passages. And this is where Raphael Warnock tells us it's right there in the Bible. Read your Bible, right? And of course, we see the early church getting together, and they distributed to all who had need. But you're absolutely right. It was not involuntary giving. It was charity. It was those who followed the best Jew, Jesus, saw that at the heart of a Jesus-centric worldview was to be a giver. He gave his life. It is why the hospital movements, most of them in America, have the name Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Eliezer, Good Samaritan, or whatever. It doesn't have, Karl Marx or Richard Dawkins or Bill Gates on the hospital.
Thank goodness. I never want to go to that one.
Yeah, for good reason. And those passages in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, that each one gave as they had ability, so that there were no needs.
Yeah.
They presupposed property rights. Even in Acts 5, when Ananias and Sapphira got killed, it wasn't because they retained some of their own ownership.
Yeah.
The text tells us why.
Yeah.
It says that they could have kept it.
Yep.
But God went after them because they lied.
They lied.
And they tried to virtue signal, as it were, which isn't courage, it's cowardice.
Gee,
And
Never heard that one before.
Right. They tried to show the world that they were good people, meanwhile putting the money right back in their pockets, right?
Yeah.
And private property, contrary to the Jew Marx, who wanted, in one sentence to, define communism, the abolishment of private property. Private property is presupposed in the 10 Commandments in Commandment 8 and 10. So again, property is a good thing. Once we understand that ultimately my view of ownership is construed as stewardship, but nonetheless, it's my sphere of responsibility to own and to create more with as the parable says in the New Testament, to take what the landowner has given me and go and double it, go create more wealth from the opportunities that I've been given. That is praised. It's not blamed.
Yeah. You also mentioned it's important, and it shows. I don't know anybody who doesn't want their own place, and they should never be made to feel guilty. Even God distributed property to the different tribes of Israel as a blessing, and it wasn't so that they could own something. You mentioned that, I hear a lot about this, that the goal is some sort of utopia. And obviously we know the real utopia that they're looking for is being in heaven before God. They're trying to create that heaven on earth scenario in a sinful world. Can you speak just a little bit to that? Because I know it's about time to let you go. But
right. The goal is utopia. Marx saw the conditions of his world and thought, this is bad. It ought not be this way, right? In a future episode, I think we'll take a look and see that Marx didn't ultimately care about people being impoverished. Marx was ultimately not an economist, and everyone knows that. It's his failed predictions. He didn't understand how economics really works. He was a philosopher, and he began with atheistic assumptions about the world and about human nature, thinking if you redistributed to them, no one would compete. Everyone would have a Toyota, the same Toyota. The beaten and broken down Toyota, of course.
Right.
But everyone would have the same thing, and then no one would want to compete. But he envisioned a world without borders, a world without religion, a world without authority. Even the state eventually must be abolished. The family must be abolished. And somehow people are going to operate just like the Beatles song, Imagine. And go back and read that, listen to that song, look at the lyrics in that song. It's a vision of the good life. He never tells us how to get there except by revolution. It will not happen by reformation, and that's why you hear about not police reform, but reimagining a world without police, defunding the police, and so forth, getting rid of authority, ultimately. This view of utopia. Even Lenin tells us Marx didn't know how to get there. Lenin didn't know how. The idea by contemporary and former Marxists is that we'll figure it out on our own. The oppressed people who are going through the revolution, we will figure it out when we get there. It's going to be costly, but no one said getting an omelet comes without breaking eggs.
Did he say that?
No.
Or are you saying it?
He said that, but as Mao said, a revolution is not a dinner party.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, it's a shame because they're driving you away from God, doing away with religion, because yes, that does create division only in the sense of because they're not equal. Faiths are not all equal, as you know. And the one thing that they're trying to take away is the one thing that can get us to a utopia, which is heaven. And it's what we all look to as obviously as people, but especially as Christians, because we're the only faith that assures people that. All the other faiths, it's a work-based system, unfortunately.
Right. In some of the best ethical systems, like I think in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, perhaps the most famous normative ethical system in writing, 2,400 years old. He was a Greek who had a vision for the good just by making observation and seeing how virtue is developed and looking at the good for man, the good life, without having revelation. He came pretty doggone close. But even in his own ethics, he mentions the word God twice as much as the word for happiness, which is the purpose for the Nicomachean Ethics. This end of man, this happiness to be like the gods, was a godlike life, according to Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
And his his proteges in the religions of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, like Al-Farabi and Moses Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas. I wrote my dissertation on that comparative exploration. They took that and ran with that and improved on Aristotle's system about the good life. But it always required God. Our ultimate telos, our ultimate end, our ultimate goal is wrapped up in our understanding of the theology. But think about the first four letters there of theology, of theos, is theory. This critical theory that began with Marx is a God perspective view of the world, but not one that the good life is godlike, it's godless. And somehow, even without a ground for ethics, without a ground for free will, for praise and blame, for reward and punishment, somehow we're supposed to imagine John Lennon's vision of the good without all of this stuff. And the road to get there, it seems so peaceful in that song. All you need is love. You need death.
Love is love.
Death.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is not the view of the good life. The other Jew, the more faithful Jew, the Jew who knew Jesus, knew best about the good life and how to guide us there. And that good life ultimately includes not only the existence of God, but central to the Christian experience was the knowledge of God, John 17.
Yeah. Well, this is so fascinating. What is the topic you'd like to touch on next time?
I think next time we could get into Marx and his view of religion, his religion of revolution, and his view of what he thinks about religious people and what should come of religious people in his utopia.
Okay, that's going to be really fun and educational. So I hope everybody keeps an eye out for the next episode and learn more, and we'll see you later. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Good to be with you.